allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like to start out by saying these proceedings are being recorded for the sole purpose of preparing accurate written minutes. Recordings that are overwritten following approval of the minutes. Eliminate all unofficial records of these proceedings.
Wow.
Start out with Bess. We have two of the commissioners here tonight. Is there anything that you would like to say?
Three commissioners.
Oh, my bad.
That's all right, Frank. Merry Christmas.
I met them too, by the way.
Merry Christmas to all. I have to leave in 5 minutes for a meeting with Kate's husband at the conservation meeting at 7 o'clock in the environmental center, so thought I'd stop in.
Looks like there's one who hasn't been sworn in yet.
That's what I missed. See, I was right.
Merry Christmas. Thank you for taking the time, especially this week.
Okay, do I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from November 16th, 2022 meeting?
So moved.
Oh, I'll second.
The second.
I have a first and a second. Any discussion on the minutes? All in favor? Aye.
Taking down notes too for meeting minutes.
You are?
I'll try to get some sanity center.
Okay. You can report out on the status of the open space guidelines.
Dan and I attended the commissioners' meeting this morning. It was on their agenda, and they approved the criteria. We gave a little bit of an explanation as to the importance of it, and everything was approved by the commissioners.
Discussion on the draft program manual. That was something that we all had homework to take home and look at. There's a couple of red marks in there I see.
Well, the red marks.
There's a lot of red marks.
The red marks were, because as I mentioned last time, I was trying to get something together before the last meeting. So the red marks were me going through it again and making some adjustments, and then also making notes of questions that we want to discuss as we move forward with this. So if we want to start going through this, section 1 is just a general introduction and some general information. I don't know if anybody had any thoughts on anything else they wanted to add to the introduction or the general information.
I see, Dawn, well, this may come up further in the discussion, that the deadline, of having a deadline or not for the application process.
Sorry. Get settled.
Continue on.
So then moving into the section 2, the program details, it starts with talking about the eligible applicants, which are Carbon County municipalities, individually or jointly applying, and nonprofit land conservation and preservation organizations that meet the criteria. And these are criteria that are found in a number of other things that I came across, so that's why these criteria were included. And please, at any point, if you have questions or suggestions or things that we should tweak, speak up.
And as Dawn and the committee developed this, the eligible applicants and those items, those 5 items, it mirrors, a lot of that mirrors the DCNR requirements, the state requirements, because if we're looking at providing 50% funding and having the applicant primarily go to DCNR that has acquisition funding, these are those requirements for land conservation that No, that's required by them.
So then eligible projects, fee simple acquisition and acquisition of conservation easements. And then the third one that we might want to have a little discussion on is also the possibility of covering transaction costs associated with eligible projects involving a full donation of the land or easement to the applicant, up to limits established by the program. So we would have to talk about what are those limits. But the first question is, do we all agree that this type of project should be eligible? At least one shaking head. And to be eligible, the project would still have to conform to all of the other requirements. It's just that the applicant's not looking for acquisition money, they would just be looking for money to cover other eligible costs.
Okay, so that was the question of what does that mean? So it's just that they're donating it somewhere else, they're not asking for money for the land, they're just asking for like title searches and things, maybe stuff
Yeah,
like
so
that goes with it.
it'll
It might
be-
actually be considerably cheaper.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
it would be considerably cheaper, and in a lot of cases, those are costs that if somebody wants to donate, it's sometimes hard to find.
Okay.
To be able to do a project, there's more cost, just because somebody wants to donate a property doesn't mean that, you know.
How often does that, is that kind of a unicorn, or is that an often?
No, it happens.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty, it happens, but it's pretty slim.
But it's certainly, I mean, we, just Wildlands did at least one donation this year.
We've done a couple this year that we've donated easements.
We actually had one with farmland, and one of the benefits of it is tax rate, because you're making that big donation.
And so then the other thing that I had added here on the last sentence was, to be eligible, the project must conform to all Carbon County Open Space Program grant requirements, and the county must retain a legal interest in the land or the easement. And so what I did was put in parentheses, in the form of a deed restriction or beneficiary status to the easement. So I just clarified what was meant by a legal interest in the easement.
Don, do we need to talk about an amount? or percentage?
I think we get into that later, as we also get into the transaction costs, later, what those are. And we can talk more about like which of those we want to be covered. But for now, it's just the idea of covering the eligible transaction costs associated with the project. And the idea that if you take money for the project, even though you're not taking the capital acquisition funds, you would still have to put the deed restriction or list the county as a beneficiary of the easement. And that's very similar, I mean, DC, that's what DCNR does, is that when you use, sometimes you can use a project as a match, like a donated project as a match for another project, but you then have to put the deed restriction on the donated one. And then ineligible projects,
Well, I just wanna know if they wanna, I mean, why don't we just do these as we go through it?
Yeah, go through and check it off if we're okay with it.
And, you know, 'cause you want people to be able to donate their land, but still get the transaction, the other costs of doing the donation. That we, in other words, we wouldn't have to fund the acquisition, but we would have to fund maybe a survey, maybe an appraisal, maybe you know, those kind of costs.
Do we need to take a vote on
For our cards.
I'm a five on that one.
You get the cards.
Well, don't print it to the new year.
Let me see.
Yeah.
You
do have them, I'm only teasing.
I think
I
if
guess
the
it's a
board,
two-parted question.
maybe you could see if the board, the majority of the board agrees that at the end, there would be a motion to approve these changes that would go to
As
the
agreed upon.
commissioners. You want to do that?
So, for this section, do we believe that, it would be cool of us to pay for some of those costs in this type of situation? Some of
Well, I
all.
guess the first question would be, are we agreeing that this type of project is eligible, right?
Mhm.
That would be the first question, before we rely on anything else.
I think they're very, I mean, in the end, even though they're worded differently, I think it means the same thing. And I think everybody shook their head. If you did not shake your head, speak now or forever hold your peace.
One? Sorry, she's too young to vote.
And then we have a listing of the ineligible projects, so parcels whose preservation is not consistent with the applicant's or county's adopted policies. Projects concluded by a signed deed before the commissioners have awarded the grant unless a waiver of retroactivity has been granted. Leases, term easements, or other legal instruments where the instruments where the acquisition is not in perpetuity, the purchase of any structure of monetary value and its appurtenant land, regardless of its proposed use, including storage sheds, garages, and barns, any land occupied by the structures or future building sites must be subtracted from the total land area submitted for funding. Land subjected to eminent domain proceedings or lands required for dedication through the land development process. And finally, a parcel that is known or suspected to be contaminated with hazardous substances or hazardous waste unless it has received DEP Act 2 clearance for the proposed use. Is everyone good with those ineligibles? And then we move on to the waiver of retroactivity. And kind of the first, we'll go through the waiver information and then we'll ask the question. So if an applicant anticipates purchasing a property or an easement or incurring costs on a project before the Carbon County Open Space Grant is awarded, a written request for a waiver of retroactivity from the county must be submitted at least 4 weeks prior to settlement and must be approved by the county prior to settlement. The granting of a waiver ensures that the funding requests for projects that are properly submitted by the application deadline remain eligible for consideration by the county commissioners, even though the work on the project has already begun. Eligibility will only apply to costs incurred after obtaining a waiver from the county. Waiver for retroactivity requests should be submitted to the Open Space Program Coordinator. The request should provide a description of the project, parcel numbers, its appraised value, and the amount of county funds likely to be requested, acres to be preserved, and why the waiver is needed. The granting of a waiver does not guarantee any county funds, nor is it any preferential consideration implied. The grant application will be weighed against all the other grant applications received. And this is something that DCNR does with their program, so this is just mirroring what DCNR does. And so then the question, based on all that information, is are we allowing waivers of retroactivity? I'm seeing a couple shaking heads and a couple people thinking.
Well, that's consistent with the program, that makes sense.
Okay, so if no one has any issues or concerns, we'll continue forward. And after I put a little yes next to it in my notes. Then the next section is funding levels and eligible transaction costs. So acquisition, this program will fund a maximum of 50% of the appraised value for fee simple land acquisition or conservation easement purposes. So this is just so there's two sets of costs. One is the acquisition and one is the transaction cost. So first is the acquisition and 50%. And should we set a funding cap for that?
How do they do that in other counties? Do they, does it vary? We don't.
I don't know.
It's up to the board, really.
Yeah, I mean, like DCNR doesn't technically have if we're talking about DCNR, they don't technically have a funding cap, but generally they won't give you more than $1 million. But sometimes they will, depending on the specific project. So I mean, you could set a cap and say that, under certain circumstances, you could exceed that, but this is the general cap. Or you could just say that, when you're reviewing the project, you'll determine if the amount they're asking for is reasonable based on the project and how much money there is.
Chester County does not have a cap. I mean, it just, they all have limited pots of money, so there's a de facto
Probably have a
cap.
lot of money.
Yeah.
Delaware County is almost entirely developed. They do have a cap and they have a small amount of money to give out every year. So I think you're more like Chester County in that you have a lot of land left.
If someone comes in with a large project, a large amount, I know when I was with DCNR, we may ask them to phase it, to come in with phase one, and we'll fund half of it at a time. If it's, we preserved Resica Falls, the scout camp.
That was
Many phases.
It was 3 phases, I think it was gonna be
Yeah.
4 or 5.
It was gonna be 4.
Yeah, they cut
And
it down
then
to 3
when we had the extra money, I think we combined 3 and 4. So it was, I don't know, over $4 million.
So it's all said and done.
So, I mean, and this is, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't even say this. There's going to be, people are gonna interject things, and even some of the discussions I've had, it isn't about who's gonna get the grant awarded to, who's gonna get the money for the land, it's about the quality of the land. And I think for the commissioners, it's, you know, they're gonna hear comments, positive or negative, like, why are we doing this? Why are we giving so much money to so-and-so and not understanding that they've submitted an application and it meets all the criteria and it's something we want to preserve and it's preserving water quality, you know, unless they come to the meetings and understand all those factors. So I don't think we should really have a limit, but issues will come up in the future.
There's a lot of questions in here that, you know, aren't, they're just questions that I wanted to make sure that everybody understood, that in some cases, sometimes it's this way and sometimes it's that way, it doesn't mean you have to do it that way. So I just wanted to at least ask the question about a cap.
We can even set a cap number, but have it with the unless extenuating circumstances. So there's an out clause, so kind of put that there as a number to just say, we'd like to aim for this. But if we had something like that came in a multiple phase or was of value, then you could suspend it, you've given yourself an exit strategy.
You can also do it the opposite way. I think you can do it the opposite way by not setting a cap, but realizing that we don't have an unlimited pot of money. And so if a big project comes in that's really expensive, that we can't fund the whole thing, then we can work with the applicant to try to phase it or whatever. I think you paint yourself in a corner if you set a cap.
I think so too.
And if you set a cap and have exceptions, then you don't really have a cap anyway. So I think it's better, my advice would be, I think it's better to do it the other way. To realize that you aren't gonna be able to maybe fund a really big project, that's a really good project, but maybe you'll find another way to
Like Dennis said,
yeah.
break it in.
Well, and would that be another situation where, okay, like we're looking at a 50% match with the expectation that might be DCNR, then it becomes a, like, who else can we parcel into this and maybe break it down a little bit more?
Mhm, right.
And it's evaluation, did the applicant, they may request more than 50%, but did they put forth enough effort to try to find a match somewhere else?
Well,
Just because you think it's worth
The
finding.
50%.
the 50% is a hard number, is a hard
Yeah.
thing.
It's
Oh,
the
okay.
cap.
We're not talking about raising it above 50%, we're talking about if that 50% is $2 million and that wipes out, you know, almost half of the pot of funding we have to deal with. And I guess the other thing is, we still don't even know exactly what that, we know there's 10 million, but a certain amount of that is gonna go towards ag. So even if we don't know what that breakdown's going to be, and I think that's gonna probably become more apparent as the ag program moves forward and this program moves forward, where the needs are. But that, I don't think that's been decided at all
Right.
yet.
And I know we had an initial meeting with the commissioners, I don't know, maybe more than a year ago. This is brand new. We have no idea what the demand is gonna be. And we met with the commissioners and bond council, and is it gonna be a line of credit? Is it gonna be, are they gonna do a bond? And they asked us, well, how much do you think you're gonna need in the first tranche of funding? And we really aren't sure what the demand is gonna be.
So, well, first off, let's address the cap issue. So is everybody now kind of on the side of, let's not have a cap?
So with the cap, is that like a yearly cap, if that's what I'm hearing from phases, or is that just a cap on the
On an
total?
On one
project.
applicant.
Per project?
Yeah, on an individual project.
I mean, it would be a question whether or not we want to spread the amount, and I know that you said if it's a really good project, we don't wanna hem ourselves up either, you know, but,
It's so hard to say at this point, because like, we have no idea what the applications are gonna be, what size tracks they are. Most of the project's gonna be 50,000 or 500,000 or more, or
You know, I'm not sure this board actually talked about the 50%.
Well, that, I wanted
That's why
to
it's
ask
in
the
red.
cap first. and then
Oh,
I was
okay,
gonna ask the
okay, all right,
50% question.
good, okay, all right. So,
But I wanted us to talk about the cap
Yep,
before we talk
okay.
about the 50%.
And you know, I don't know, and maybe Don may have a better mental picture, but I don't know that, as far as sizes of tracts of land that are still available, you know, as larger tracts are gone or committed, and, I don't know if there's an average size, Don, but that's probably a weird
No, I mean,
question.
you know, I'm working on a project now that is 1,200 acres. I don't know if it's gonna go forward or not. But, and then I'm sure that there are projects out there that are 50 acres. So I don't think that we really know yet.
We
And
just acquired at Drake's Creek, that was 600.
But so back to the cap question, so we can get to the next question.
That's where I was with the district.
Are we in agreement, no cap?
Okay.
Anybody want a cap?
I agree with the no cap, I just also think we need to be cognizant of, we have no clue if this is gonna continue to be rolling funding or whatnot, we don't wanna blow it all in one year, like I'd hate to see that too, so.
And, well,
Well, we can come, I mean, for now, we can say no cap, and then
Yeah.
after going through the rest, maybe we come back
Right,
and
once we
say-
get applications, then we can evaluate it.
you know, there's a wild idea that, because when we set the 10 million, we did a survey, and if we went to 20 million, there were less people gonna vote for it. But there's been discussion that, like, we should have had more. So if we burn up this 10 million, you never know, we don't know, that the county may say, let's do another 10 million. And so,
I think not having a cap is good, because what happens if we have, timing's everything, we have things just fall into place where there's a bunch of people at one time, not even initially. Let's say 2-3 years down the road, just certain tracts of land just came up that they're up for it. It could, in essence, like, keep us from that in that scenario as well. If we had caps, people might say, well, okay, then you're only gonna be able to do.
yeah, and in that scenario, when I worked for DCNR, maybe it was 08 in the crash, people who were land rich but cash poor were selling. So, you never know.
Yeah, I think that's a good reason not to have it.
Okay, so we're agreed on no cap. Now, let's have a discussion about the 50%. So the 50% is set at 50% because, one, you know, mimics the DCNR funding, but even more importantly is that that's kind of the tipping point of you want to be able to leverage your funding. So you want to try and at least leverage it 1-to-1. So there's where the 50% comes in. I mean, ideally, if you can leverage it, you know, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, if you can get better leverage on it, that's great, but I don't think that we want to go, I don't necessarily think we want to go above 50% because then we're not leveraging the money and you're going to spend it a lot more quickly.
If I might add, that also would go contrary to the spirit and the word of the campaign. Because as we were out advocating, we did use the potential of a 50% over and over again. So I had to throw that out there. Yeah.
And as Don could attest to, when in negotiations with landowners, if we say, if the applicant knows they can get 50% from the county, and even if they don't get a full say they get 30% from another funding source, at times it's been a negotiation tool to get the property owner to take less than fair market value. So there's.
Or if they come in with a better pie cobbled together, that'll rank them up the list. The onus is on them.
So unless there's any argument for having it more than 50%, I think, are we good with 50%? Is there anybody that would want to see it less than 50%? And that makes it harder to cobble together projects in many cases.
It's so hard because we don't know how much activity we're gonna have, you know?
Like DCNR will not fund more than 50%.
Correct.
Right, so I think 50 is where we should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ideal because there is already 50% funder out there, if this is 50%. And then if there's certain cases where it's a bigger project and you have to couple together more funding. Okay, so then we move on to the eligible transaction costs. And in this case, the program will reimburse a maximum of 50% of the eligible transaction costs for a successfully completed project. Reimburse, we'll get to that. I'm not sure if we want to talk about that now or later. Maybe we'll push that to later, but it's highlighted here so that we know if we need to come back or change that or not. But so the idea is, again, similar to DCNR, they will fund 50% of the project. So how that breaks down is, 50% of the acquisition, 50% of the transaction cost. And so that's what we're looking at here. And then we dig more into what are those eligible transaction costs. And again, and also important to note, successfully completed project, the county shouldn't be giving out any money if the project is not successful. But again, this kind of falls under the reimbursement question that we'll discuss later on, but just something to keep in your mind. So eligible transaction costs, so the appraisal, to be eligible for reimbursement, the appraisal or appraisal review must follow the county's appraisal policy and be approved by the county. The appraisal policy is a secondary document I don't think has been shared with you yet, but there is an appraisal policy that we've been working on based on some models. Then the next one is a survey. The county requires a boundary survey to be completed for each project, performed by a professional land surveyor registered in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The surveyor must visibly mark all property corners with monuments. The applicant must provide the county with a survey plan with the signature and seal of the surveyor in PDF format and a georeferenced CAD file, as well as the legal description. This is, again, a lot of these requirements are based on what DCNR requires. And I think that to a certain extent, it's good to make a lot of the requirements for this program match up with DCNR, so then you don't have different requirements floating around, and I think that's where you sometimes get in trouble.
Would it be necessary if a participant that wants to donate their land just recently, within months, had the property surveyed?
I believe so.
You think so?
I think so because, so with DCNR, there's been times where I've acquired land and the property owner had a survey that was up to date.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have to be, you wouldn't have to put a time frame to it, but, a relatively recent up-to-date survey of the property. I would recommend that the applicant, double check that. I say that because we fell into the trap of using a survey for a project, and it was a relatively recent survey, but we went out on the land and found out that somebody had built part of their house on part of the property, so we ended up having to go back, and this was with DCNR funding, so we had to do a whole, get approval for all that, and DCNR to kind of swap land to make sure that, we could fix the survey boundary. But yes, to answer your question, I think that yes, a recent survey could be accepted as long as it,
No problem.
yes, has no problems.
So, is that a wordage that we would want to try to iron out, or no? What recent means?
I don't think you need the word recent, I mean, you need an accurate survey.
Yeah,
I mean, in theory, I could go home tonight and build that wall over the boundary, even though my survey was done 3 days ago. So it's an accurate survey.
and I don't know if anything in here precludes that it needs to be a survey done right away. It just says a completed survey.
I think the program manager would need to be on top of that.
Yeah, I think that's more of a nuance. Here's the survey we have, is this sufficient?
And usually in lending, anything over 2 years is null and void as far as when I worked for the farm loan program, anything that was over a 2-year on a survey, you threw it out and redid it. That was kind of the professional standard.
In our office, we go out and look for the monuments, because you require monuments. The monuments are where they say they are, you're good. If they aren't, you're not good.
We automatically do a survey.
I like that language, that kind of requires an accurate boundary survey, I like that. That kind of answers the questions a little bit, making sure it's.
It's just in the first sentence then, she was
I mean,
suggesting.
a professional land surveyor in Perry's always 50.
Oh, if we add in
Correct.
an accurate
Okay.
boundary survey to be completed for each project. But we're not defining exactly when it was completed. Then the next is an environmental assessment. A phase 1 environmental assessment is required for all projects. D is title insurance. The county requires that the full value of the rights being acquired be insured. Title insurance is required for fee simple acquisitions and the acquisitions of easements. E, closing costs. So costs including recording costs, deed preparation costs, and tax proration. There's a ... there because I didn't know if there was any other costs anybody else could think of that should be included in code closing costs. I think those are the standard recording costs, deed prep costs, tax proration. So if nobody has any other things to be added to that list, I can just cross out those last 2 dots. F, legal costs, and I clarified that that is to mean legal costs of the applicant. So the applicant would have legal review on, on the agreement of sale, on the deed, all the closing documents, on the title. And it would not cover legal costs for the landowner. So if the landowner, that would be a separate thing, and they would have to cover their own legal costs. This is just to make sure the costs of the applicant are covered.
Do you all understand the difference between the landowner and the applicant? I just want to make sure of that, because, so it might be Wildlands Conservancy is the applicant to purchase a land from a particular landowner. Wildlands Conservancy's legal costs would be eligible here, not the landowner's legal costs. You understand? I just wanted to make sure, because I know that when I first heard this stuff, I was, a deer in the headlights 20 years ago when I was trying to do this.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask if there's something.
So the other thing is, in some cases, there are limits to the legal costs. So they'll say like a maximum of a certain percentage, but do we want to get into those weeds or not?
It's hard, I mean, if the applicant, I mean, the municipality or the land conservancy should not have unexpectedly large legal costs. Sometimes the landowner would, if heirs sue each other, for example, or they would.
Are those costs borne by the landowner and reciprocated back after the deal goes through?
What,
You know
the
what I'm saying?
landowner's costs?
Right.
Well, they
Like with
get paid for the
farmland
land.
program, Once it's all said and done, that is borne by the county.
No.
No, not in
you
this
don't-
case.
You don't do
no,
that,
no.
all right.
I mean,
No.
they're getting paid for the land. All the landowner's getting is paid for the land.
All right.
In a sense, think about it as the landowner, if they have legal costs to clean certain things up, to get it ready to be an eligible application, that's all on them, to get it to the point of a land trust or municipality applying.
Okay, so then the next one is so this goes back to the donation, that eligible project that we talked about earlier, which is transaction costs associated with the donation. This program may help cover the transaction costs associated with projects involving a full donation of land or easements up to the limits established by this program. And so so now here's where it could be, are we only funding 50% of those transaction costs? Or because the property was donated, are we willing to fund up to 100% of those transaction costs? And do we want to have a cap on that?
Okay, does DCNR typically fund 50% of those costs?
Well,
or
so-
is it-
Typically don't take easements, so they're not gonna fund any.
Well, no, it could be fee too.
That's true.
So how
That's
DCNR works is that if you donate
Yeah.
well, first off, I don't know, you'd be hard pressed to go through all the trouble of getting a DCNR grant just to cover the transaction costs. But if they did, how it works is, like I said before, they'll cover 50% of the project costs. So if like the land donation is worth $500,000, or say it's even worth $200,000, the donated land's worth $200,000, the transaction costs are like $30,000. So you got $230,000 project, so $30,000 is way less than 50%, so yes, they would cover that full amount. But so whatever the project
From a
is,
practical standpoint, you would not be applying to
Right.
them if it was a donation.
Right.
yes, correct. So in this case, this would be a way, if you covered it up to 100%, this would be a way to help fund donated projects, and more likely than not, you're gonna get really good leverage. It's not gonna be one-to-one, it's gonna be, the project cost itself, it's gonna be, it's gonna be a much better leverage.
Well, is there any other program, entity, what have you, that, like, outside of DCNR that does help with those kind of projects, or is that?
There is currently, but that money's going away
Oh, okay.
very soon.
Okay.
So that project I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to get it up and running in order to take advantage of the end of that money.
But that was a unique funding from the foundation
Yeah.
that gave us that.
Okay.
Typically over the years, we haven't had that. What about I think of a percentage, and like for a large donation, I don't know if this would work. Like, DCNR has a thing on construction projects, they'll pay up to 15% for the engineering and design. Do we put a percentage where, so that it isn't exorbitant? And it's,
So,
I don't know.
I mean, we could say that it'll fund up to 100% of the transaction costs as long as that represents less than 50% of the project cost, or less than some other percent of the project costs.
Right.
And so in that case, you would have to have an appraisal to submit, because generally, if a landowner's donating, we wouldn't see an appraisal until after the project is done, because we don't have to do an appraisal as a land trust if a landowner's donating, but they have to do an appraisal to get a tax deduction. And so then when they submit the Form 8283 to us to sign about their donation, they have to include an appraisal with that. But in this case, this would require an appraisal that you wouldn't normally have to do if we add it in that way, unless we agree that it can be based on like the assessed value, market value that the county's put on it.
Like on the Penrose, the 2,300 acres,
Mm-hmm.
the survey for that cost
Yeah, these surveys could be
$100,000.
But the project itself was over $6 million. So, that's a small percentage of $6 million.
Could you put some language that we may fund more than 50% if the cost of the project is, I'm looking for an open end on the other side. Like, we're gonna do 50%, but we might do more, or we have the ability to do more if that total cost is less than.
We had a couple of landowners who had wonderful pieces of property and no real heirs, and they wanted to donate the land. But they just really couldn't afford to put up the money for the survey and the I mean, it was a burden on them. And a couple of them had life interests in the land. And so we found a way from Chester County and a local foundation to cover those costs, because they were donating it. And it's expensive to be generous, they would have had to have come up with 20 or 25,000 for surveys and appraisals and things. So but you don't want to be taken advantage of. You don't want someone to give you this absolutely enormous transaction cost. But if the property meets all of your criteria and they're giving it to you?
So I
Don't
That's
you
what I'm
wanna
saying,
help
more,
them?
instead of just saying, we'll cover 100% if there's no other costs, we may go more than 50%.
Or could we say like, or we may go up to 100%?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that-
I
I
think
think
the
that
way that
gives
you
you the wiggle
worded
room.
it originally sounded nice, up to
You know, up to
100%,
100, it could be
pending,
1%.
and it's 50%
Right.
of
Yeah,
the appraised.
exactly.
Because that kind of loosely sets a cap then at that point.
I mean,
Can you put like
But
case
the
by
dollar amount
case?
could be much less.
Well, so I think if we say, this program may help cover up to 100% of the transaction
like
costs
that,
associated with the project. That gives
Yeah.
the board
Yeah.
the wiggle room, just like the whole cap idea, of we're not gonna put a cap, but we have the wiggle room to,
should there be some sort of floor though, as well?
Just remember too, when you talk about cap limits and percentages and stuff like that, you can always go down, but you can't go up. Meaning, if it's set at 100, then if we don't have the money, you guys could fund lower. But now, when you have that 50%, and we do have the money, we can't go above that 50%, that's set. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about this with caps and everything like that. By setting a higher cap, you can go lower based on the funding and everything like that. Nothing saying that you have to give the full amount.
so I think then we're covered with that, with the up to.
And the whole case-by-case idea, that's your whole purpose for me. That's what this board is for, case by case.
Alright, excellent. So then, we move into ineligible costs. Because we always have to list things that are ineligible.
Did you want to go back to that? Or did we just finish that?
I have the same question.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the
Oh, there-
reimbursement, yeah.
Oh, no, the reimbursement, we're gonna talk about that
Oh,
later.
okay, all right. I thought
Later,
you were-
later.
Okay, all right.
It's in a whole nother section later.
Okay.
It's
Before we
about like
wander
how the
too
program
far,
works.
far past the legal, I'm assuming the solicitors, somebody has looked at this at some point, or will look
Not
at
yet.
it?
Well, no, so we
Okay.
need to get this whole thing together before it goes to the county for approval, and at that point, solicitor will look at it.
Right, we want the advisory board to make the final decisions for the final draft, and then it'll go to the commissioners and the solicitor to,
And
do
it
it
may or may
together.
not come back
Should
for
they
us
have
to change
language
things.
that would be, achieve the same thing that we're trying to, but more understandable.
But yes, to answer your reimbursement question, that is part of the, how the program works thing at
Okay.
the, later on.
Sorry.
So, no, but I'm glad you bring it up because I don't want us to forget about it. Ineligible costs, any costs in excess of the grant contract amount, so you can't like get a grant for a certain amount and come back and say, hey, we want more. Costs incurred after the contract termination date, so if you close out the contract, you can't come back again and ask for more. Costs incurred after reimbursement of county funds. Any costs not included as a county funds requested in the financial summary form in the grant application. So if you want money for it, you gotta put it on the application. In-house services and staff time. So that is for the applicant, you can't write into the bane of the nonprofit is, no grants give us money to cover our time, or it's very rare. So this is saying that the municipality or the land trust can't ask for staff time. Demolition costs, so if there's buildings that you're gonna demo on the property, that's not covered. Site cleanup, removal of trash, for example, not covered, ineligible. Acquisition cost of any structure of monetary value and the appurtenant property. Mortgage or loan interests, costs associated with the appraisal that the county determines is not in compliance with the guidelines. And any other cost not specifically noted as eligible for grant reimbursement. Okay, so moving on to eligible sources of matching funds. Cash. Municipalities are encouraged to use the county grant funds to leverage, I'm gonna change municipalities to applicants. So that covers municipalities and land trusts. In some cases, counties have different programs for municipalities and land trusts, but I think that it's much easier to have one program and then there will be certain documents that might be somewhat different. Like the resolution, because the resolution for a land trust would be a little different than a resolution for municipality, but I think in general, I tried to change everything to applicant so that it's not one or the other. So yes, cash can be used to leverage funds. Non-cash, landowner donation of value is an eligible source of matching funds. When a landowner is willing to sell their land or development rights in the case of an easement for less than the appraised value, the difference between the sales price and the appraised value can be used as a match for the county's preservation partnership. Oops, oh boy, oops, yep.
Everyone understand that?
Well, no, I found a typo.
I know why you're fixing-
I copied
Why you're
something.
fixing the typo.
Yeah.
The county's open space grant funds. I didn't build this from scratch. Grant award process. The timing and amount of any grant award is at the sole discretion of the county commissioners. That's just because we can't guarantee how quickly it's gonna get on the agenda and get approved. And then grant payments. So here's where we get into that reimbursable question and some other questions. So I'll read first. All county grant funds awarded through this program for acquisition costs are provided at the time of closing. So that means that we're not gonna give you the capital acquisition funds up front. Payment requests must be made 30 days prior to closing. And then a question that I had was, should these checks be made to the applicant or directly to the closing title company? Because I've seen it done different ways, and also, I mean, wiring is another. It might not need to be a check.
And I think with this, without getting into the weeds, and I know Mike isn't a commissioner yet, but it's gonna come down the pipe. And this whole thing, even for the planning office, that since this is new, but the county has a process with vendors on how they pay things and how checks go in and out. So this is where the solicitor and the commissioners are really gonna have to scrub this to say, how do we want this to work? Or how does it work?
Does it need to be specified or not, and if so, what options?
Right.
I mean, what's
Do
the
you have to
existing,
specify, or do you just say?
what's farmland preservation? I mean, that's the most congruent program, so what do they do?
Well, that goes to the
Well,
landowner, though.
we set the closing date, so that makes things a lot easier. Okay, and when we get the check, the one from the state, they come written out to the landowner.
But do you
Well, they-
specify?
That comes to the county, right? Well, any money that's going to the landowner has to go through closing, through escrow, so it's not gonna, but the question here is, should the county be sending, and again, might be a question for the solicitor or the county, but it's a question, so that's why it's here, is, should those funds go directly to closing for the acquisition funds and closing costs? Or should they go to the applicant who then sends them to closing?
Our
And-
office much prefers that it go directly to the title company because closing is more efficient.
Yes,
But I
and
don't.
Monroe
I don't-
County, I believe,
yeah.
sent the funds directly to closing.
So in farmland preservation, when the county's funds are being used, how does that flow? How does that?
Basically, the state and the county funding are both written out to the checks are both written out to the landowner. But they send the
And you have
ones
those checks
from
ahead
the
of
state
time.
get sent to us paid. And then, once I have their checks, then I process for the county. And once I have both those checks in hand, then we set up a settlement date.
And then,
Uh,
who does DCNRs go to?
DCNRs goes to the applicant.
So then that, it would
So
make
that's,
sense.
again,
It makes sense to mirror that if that's how so it's not incongruent.
Again, I don't know if we even need to discuss this,
I
it's
think
just,
it's a legal question.
yeah, I think it's probably a legal question, but I wanted to have it on here so that it's not something that slips through the cracks and that everybody knows that that's something that needs to be figured out probably at the county level.
Yeah, and we're also gonna have to look at that 30 days, just because of the way our county process goes, sometimes that can get a little tight.
So we're gonna mark this one as one that needs more advice from the commissioners and the solicitor.
That's a logistical thing. Once
Yeah, those decisions will have to be made by the planning office and convention. So then, open the bid forward.
Okay.
Passion on it.
And so then the next question, which again, we could talk about, but the county, it might be a county decision again, but I think it's worth us talking about this more, is that all county grant funds awarded through this program for eligible transaction costs are provided on a reimbursement basis only. Funds are dispersed after the project is complete and after the applicant submits the required documentation. So my question was, do we want to keep it like that? But that means that the applicants and municipalities have to outlay their money ahead of time and then get reimbursed. And my thought was, the municipalities in Carbon County, are they able to do that? Or would it make more sense to do something similar to DCNR where they get a partial payment up front to help pay for that stuff? But with some of the money's withheld until closing. But again, you gotta know that if the project doesn't go through, they gotta give the money back.
What's the percentage?
So how DCNR does it, when you're awarded the grant, you can get 50% upfront. And that's of the whole project, because again, they just talk about it in the project sense. So you get 50% of the whole award upfront. And then once you've got all of your due diligence stuff done, you submit it to them for review, and then you can request, they'll let you know when you can request the next 40%. So basically, you have 90% of the grant in hand to go to closing. But that still means you have to have 10%, which is sometimes a hardship because, you know, most recently, that 633 acre property we did, that 10% was $100,000 from DCNR. So if you're a municipality or even a land trust in some cases, you'd have to either have a pot of money or be borrowing potentially, you know, a chunk of money until you can get the reimbursement. Which is why I was thinking instead of, you know, just all the transaction costs are reimbursed at the end, that maybe we want to talk about or recommend, and again, the county might just nix it, or they might say, hey, this works, recommend that they can get a certain amount up front to help them cover those transaction costs as they're working through the project, with again, the disclaimer that if it doesn't work, they have to give it back.
Yeah, this is something we're gonna have to, we're gonna be talking about, if we go to a workshop meeting with the commissioners, these kind of questions are gonna come up. I just feel a lot of municipalities aren't gonna have upfront money. And so, I mean, land trust, even though it's a struggle sometimes, there's a line of credit or they make it work. But again.
Or sometimes we get bridge loans.
Bridge loans, yeah. But keep in mind, if the county, and again, whether the county's gonna be comfortable giving out, money up front, the application's gonna be approved, there's gonna be an agreement of sale, like, a lot of things are gonna be nailed down, so the chance of it going south are pretty slim.
Yes. And I mean, I guess you could, I mean, I think in the application, I'm trying to think of where it is that you're supposed to have the agreement of sale when you're applying. That's, you know, they're ready to go. But, you know, worst case scenario, you should have the agreement of sale before you're awarded the money. So ideally, like Dennis said, you would have an agreement signed, so it's much less likely that the project's gonna fall through. I think it's very rare that you have to give money, that we've ever done projects where we had to give money back because the project didn't move forward.
Experience with programs like this is it's purely reimbursement, if only from the program staff side, it's cleaner. You know, then you don't have that issue, you never have that problem.
Right.
So, get it, but for the county's purposes, you guys, that might be too much of a juggle to be going through.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my concern, and I'll put this out there to people that are, you know, work in municipal governments in Carbon County, is would it potentially nix projects because they can't get some upfront funding?
Yeah, that's the big concern.
And you don't wanna go down that path where you're putting up roadblocks to this type of progress, so. What do we do to make sure that there's more buy-in and ability to buy?
Well, I think we could carry a recommendation from you to the commissioners and the solicitor that you would like that to happen, but these are legal questions and questions that only the commissioners and the solicitor can give us answers to. So if you're okay with that, we can just take this section to them with your recommendations and say, you know, how should we do this?
So, but everybody seems to think that like an initial grant allocation, aside from the potential issues, but that if it's possible, an initial grant allocation would help move projects
When
along.
we built a manure storage facility, I didn't like getting a loan for $475,000, but I got one with the expectation it was getting paid in 6 months. So you do what you gotta do to get it to work.
Now, Don, when you talk about this, does that mean they just say, okay, so you're requesting, like, let's say $500,000, and they're giving you upfront costs, so they just give you $20,000 and say, here?
So,
Or is
again-
it paid as it's
No.
going along?
No, so what I'm envisioning here is that you're gonna already know the breakdown between the acquisition and transaction. And we could say that you could get so much, a certain percent of the transaction costs up front, and then to get the last part, you'd have to like close out the grant at the end. But with DCNR, again, it's all the costs are lumped into one project cost, so they give you 50%. As soon as you get that grant agreement, they give you 50%. And there have been instances over the years where they, as soon as you get that grant agreement, they want you to request that 50% because it's like they want to see it out the door so that the legislature is not seeing a giant pot of money there saying, oh, you guys have all this money, why do you need it for? And because apparently no matter how much you tell them that it's already allocated, it doesn't, they still think it's money up for grabs.
What I think we might find the county maybe being more acceptable to is if they're under agreement, pay as they go kind of thing, so they have to get the appraisal, but then once the appraisal's done and they get the invoice, they'll have to submit that to the county to get a percentage of payment. Same thing with the survey or that kind of stuff. That would probably be more audit-proof for the county to
Okay.
save them. But
I think
again, that's something that we'd have to talk about with the
I mean, that's-
commissioners and everything.
I think the other thing we'd have to look at is what's the turnaround time on that? Because then you're probably, normally you get an invoice and it's due, in 30 days. So how quickly can the county turn around that reimbursement request?
Well, basically, you're submitting that invoice to mostly a municipality or something, they're gonna have the same criteria and everything that we have at the county.
So instead of a payment up front, what you're saying is that you could request reimbursements on a rolling basis. How do we feel about that?
You've basically been allotted a tranche, you've got an allocated pool of money and you can peel off of it.
Yeah, again, but it makes more paperwork and more processing than if it was
2
like
to
a
3
lump
weeks
sum.
for us to turn a transaction. 2 to 3 weeks, because it has to be voted on and everything, green sheeted, sheeted and everything, 2 to 3 weeks.
So it could be rolling like that.
So it could take just as long for for the municipality to pay it, to get approval to write the check anyway. So by the time so by the time you guys write the check, the money will be hopefully coming in.
Only meet once a month, these guys meet every week. So, counting does
Yeah,
it quick.
but those things would have to be, in order to speed it up, it would probably have to skip over you guys and go right through us with the, but that would all be in the agreement. That would be all in the
No,
agreement.
it's not skipping them, because all they're doing, all they're doing is.
Yeah.
They're not responsible for paying the
Right,
bills.
they're just approving,
Skip
they're
ahead.
recommending projects, they're not, I mean, that's gonna be the open space coordinator's job, is to, they get this reimbursements request.
But I mean, for the funding part of it, of how much funding each one gets, isn't that, don't they make the recommendation to the commissioner of how much they're willing to give to each project?
Yes, but that has
Set
not,
the contract pretty much.
yeah, but that doesn't have anything to do with.
But once that's
Once that's rolling
Yeah,
in.
this is after this board is
Yeah.
approved, yeah.
So can we just make the recommendation that we want some kind of upfront and then go back and decide on the percentage? Or is there a percentage recommendation?
Well, I think he's arguing instead of an upfront payment, it's a rolling reimbursement. This could be something that changes I mean,
Yeah, they're gonna have to weigh in.
they're gonna have to decide what makes more sense, so maybe this is a section where we have notes on the side to them of like, here's the options, which works best. Then the last paragraph there just says that reimbursement requests must be submitted no later than 60 days after the contract termination date. County grant funds are only available for expenses incurred prior to the contract date if the county has granted a waiver of retroactivity. The contract length, again, this is something the county is going to have to approve, but I put 3 years from the date the grant is awarded.
Is that standard?
That's DCNR standard.
Most
That
counties
contract date,
are
36
3.
months, do you have?
And I mean, especially if county's first in money. So, if you get the county grant, then you have to wait 6 months before you can hit the DCNR cycle or something. Obviously, moving forward, we try and get them in sync, but initially, I don't think it's gonna be in sync.
When you send this to the commissioners, if you could ensure in the notes where it matches up to DCNR, if you could put a specific note, because then that'll save the solicitor a lot of research time if he knows, I'm simply looking at a DCNR to make sure it squares and stuff like that. It'll save him a lot of research time.
Anybody want to,
If it's not, if it's like early January, not next week,
Yeah, no, it would,
I can,
yeah, I don't think so.
I'll do it.
Appraisal requirements, in order to establish the current value of the property or easement, an appraisal report must be submitted with the grant application. If funding is awarded for the project, the applicant is required to obtain a technical review of the original appraisal prior to reimbursement of any funds. This does match with the DCR requirements. If the grant award is $1 million or more, and we can take this language out, this is just language I saw and left it in, from another county. If the grant award is $1 million or more, or at the sole discretion of the county, the applicant may be required to obtain a second appraisal instead of a technical review to confirm the original valuation conclusion. On a case-by-case basis, in instances where the grant award is a small percentage of the value, the technical review requirement may be waived. And then there's a link to the appraisal policy, which, like I said, is in the works. So how do we feel about the nuances after the technical review? Potentially requiring a second appraisal, or potentially not requiring a technical review if it's a small grant?
Would that secondary appraisal be at the cost of the applicant, or would that also be another thing that would get a 50% coverage?
The problem here is that
The review appraisal isn't eligible.
Well, the initial,
I guess you would know. I was thinking that you wouldn't know until later, but you would know, because if you're asking for more than $1 million, then you would know, and you would factor that into your financial thing,
Okay.
that you're going to need a full appraisal instead of just a review.
I'm gonna ask to be dismissed, I don't feel good.
Oh, of course. Hope you feel better.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
You get
Merry
home okay?
Christmas, Dick.
Pardon?
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, we don't see ya.
Yeah.
So there's two different questions there, the million or more, and then the case by case for the low end of not requiring that. There's two questions, right?
Yes.
I think the second one's seems to be pretty easy to say, yeah. That, you know, I think that's not very controversial. It's the first one that really we need to discuss probably. What do you think about that case by case basis of waiving the review of the appraisal if it's so small? And what about the first one then?
Well, the question about whether we can or can't, that might also be a legal, if we'll be allowed to waive it.
The solicitor, the county can decide. I don't know if there's a legal precedent for that has a requirement one way or the other. But they might decide that they'd like it one way or the other.
Right.
So I mean, we could leave it like this if we're all in agreement with it, and they might come back and say no. And I mean, in terms of requiring a second full appraisal instead of a technical review.
Yeah, let's see what.
I could go either way.
Yeah, I could go either way. It's a lot of money getting a second appraisal.
Yeah.
A review is pretty thorough.
I mean, so
If you fail technical review, you're gonna do a second appraisal anyway.
yeah.
I mean, does that happen? I mean,
Yeah,
you guys,
it does.
does a lot, I mean, like
Not a lot.
50-50?
Not a
No,
lot,
not
like-
50/50,
like
but on
on land,
occasion,
yeah.
yes, yeah, a
Less than
technical review will be
10%.
like,
We had one recently.
yeah, because a technical review it's a desk review, so they're not going out and looking at the property, but they're looking at like how they're looking at all the pieces to make sure they make sense. So they're not saying, yes, the property, the original appraisal says the property's worth $1 million, and yes, I think it's worth $1 million. They're saying, based on all the pieces that went into this, everything was done right, and these all seem like reasonable assumptions to get to this number. So they're not like saying the number's right, they're saying that all the pieces to get there, and they might say it seems reasonable, but they're not necessarily.
So we had a really, a township that really wanted land for a park. And it's a beautiful wooded parcel. And the landowner insisted on a certain appraiser, and everyone felt the value in the appraisal was unreasonably high, and that appraisal failed the technical review. The technical reviewer said, based on certain standards, and this does not meet our.
But then in
does not
that
meet
case,
the
that
standard.
appraisal would be thrown out, wouldn't it? And you
It
would
failed
get reimbursed.
technical review. The property was worth in excess of $1 million. There would have been state money involved. It required a technical review, and they failed the technical review.
Yeah, so that wouldn't get reimbursed.
Well, they had to go out
Yeah,
and
the
probably get another.
reimbursement was the least of the worries, right? But
They had
yeah,
to
they
get
had to
another
get
appraisal.
another appraisal.
So I mean, I suppose to keep
Hardly
it,
ever happens.
to keep it clean, we could just take out this,
Yeah, I would keep it simple and not get
Yeah.
into explaining all the nuances
So
of
if
what we're gonna do or why we're
if we
gonna do
take
it.
out if the grant award is, the sentence about if the grant
Yeah,
award is 1 million or
Just say
more,
the sole.
but then we'll leave the on a case-by-case basis, we could waive that technical review for small projects.
I think we're offering you $1 million, we're gonna be asking for a lot. I think that wouldn't be unexpected.
So I'm marking out the 1 million, the requirement for projects over $1 million. But leaving the case-by-case for the small projects, leaving the technical review. Okay, we have 19 more minutes. Yeah, and I didn't
Pick up the pace.
I did not think we would get through all this, but we'll hopefully finish going through this in January. But let's see how much further we can get. Well, there's not a ton more here,
Right,
but,
there's 2 more pages.
I think it'll also be good if, since we've gone through a lot of information, if it just gives people a chance to digest until we finalize, this is what we want to send to commissioners.
Yeah, let's at least get section 2 done.
Yes. So, where are we?
Piece of-
12. Required permanent deed restriction and conservation easements. So A, for a fee simple acquisition, as a condition of funding disbursement for fee simple acquisition projects, the county approved deed restriction must be, missing a word, be included in the deed for the property when it is purchased by the applicant to ensure the perpetual preservation of the land. This matches up with the DCNR requirement because there is a DCNR deed restriction. The applicant will coordinate with the county to determine the appropriate land area to be encumbered by the deed restriction. Land area excluded from the deed restriction is not required to be subdivided, but the required survey will identify and describe the area subject to the deed restriction. This is also consistent with DCNR.
But Dawn, I don't know if the county has deed restriction language. They're gonna look at some examples, right? They have to,
Yeah, well, here's the thing, once you start looking at this program, then you figure out, oh, there's like 10 other
Yeah.
things that need to be designed. One is the appraisal thing, you'll see even more. Another one is the deed restriction. There's going to be language that needs to be added into the conservation easement that the county, will need, and so we're getting into that next. So there's a bunch of other pieces. So just us finishing the manual doesn't mean, oh, we're ready to start the project. There's a bunch of other pieces that need to be crafted, and some of them will, we can't we can maybe put together like the bare bones of it, but that would really be like a solicitor, a lawyer needs to design it in a way that Carbon County is okay with. So conservation easements, the holder of the conservation easement must have the capacity to monitor and manage the easement. It is recommended that any municipal entity wishing to acquire a conservation easement partner with a nonprofit land conservation organization to hold or co-hold the easement. In such cases, a holder agreement should be executed between the co-holders of the easement to define the rights and responsibilities of each holder. So we're not saying that a municipality can't hold an easement by itself, but we're strongly recommending that it would be better because of, changes in municipalities. You don't want to have new folks in the municipality and they don't know what they need to do in order to monitor and manage that easement. So applicants that are awarded funds for conservation easements shall use the county-approved conservation easement language as a template. The most recent We Conserve PA model can serve as the template with the addition of language which recognizes the county funding and the county as a beneficiary to the easement. That is something, that's actually more of a note. I don't know if that language actually needs to be included in the manual. So it could be that the county, so if we take that sentence out, it could be that the county, because the We Conserve PA model is updated, and so either the county would have guidelines of which sections need to be added into the model, or they would add those sections into the model every time the model's updated, and then you just have to go to the county to get the county model. So we need to figure out which is the better course of action, but that sentence is in there so that we know to think about that.
Is the county funding and beneficiary in that template? Is that,
Yeah, so there are spaces for it. So the
but
template,
it's noted on the template?
it's noted on the template, but not the specific county language. So generally, like when I work with a municipality, I add them as a beneficiary